Hello and welcome to September's Goop Book Club. So excited to have you here. I am Kiki Koroshetz. I'm an editor at Goop and the leader of our book club. Every month, if you're new, we pick a book to read together. We have a Facebook group where we discuss throughout the month. You can always find all the details on goop.com/goopbookclub. We have Q&As with the authors and lots of good stuff. And then, of course, every month at the end, I get to show up here and talk with the author live, who I'm going to bring on in a moment. We are live, so if you have questions, you can drop them right into the chat box, and the team will send them over to us. And per usual, I'm going to announce our next month's October pick at the end, so stay tuned for that. So this month, of course, we've been reading A Farewell to Gabo and Mercedes, which I absolutely loved. I read it again this week, cried again, laughed. So wonderful. This is Rodrigo Garcia's memoir about growing up the son of the famous writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his brilliant mom Mercedes, who we talked a lot about in our book club Zoom yesterday. And it's about him being with them at the end of their lives. It's very beautiful. Rodrigo is also a film and television writer and director. I'm so happy to have him with us here today. We're going to bring him on, and he's going to read the first chapter. Rodrigo, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Just now that you said that you discussed my mom in the book group, I thought, oh God, I wish I would have heard that. I wish you would have heard that.
That was actually something that came up. We were like, we want to know we were like, can we be around this lunchtime table? What was Mercedes saying? We had a lot of fun talking about it.
Yes, a lot of opinions and a lot of personality, for sure. Yeah.
No, I think one of the best lines was you said something like, your dad always said she was the most surprising person that he ever met, and I felt like that summed it up nicely.
Yeah, and he said that till, as long as he had memory, he kept saying she's, I always remember there was a, Richard Burton, who had, of course, many love affairs with Liz Taylor and many marriages. Late in life, in his final days, he still said, she still fascinates me. And this was a little bit like that.
I can see that. Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and read the first chapter? Thank you for saying
yes
to that.
Of course. When my brother and I were children, my father made us promise to spend New Year's Eve of the year 2000 with him. He reminded us of that commitment several times throughout our adolescence, and his insistence was embarrassing to me. I eventually came to interpret it as his wish to still be alive on that date. He would be 72, I would be 40, the 20th century would come to an end. Those milestones could not seem further away when I was a teen. After my brother and I became adults, the promise was seldom mentioned, but we were indeed all together the night of the new millennium in my father's favorite city, Cartagena de Indias. We had a deal, you and I, my father said to me shyly, perhaps then also somewhat embarrassed by his insistence. That's right, I said, and we never spoke of it again. He lived another 15 years. When he was in his late 60s, I asked him what he thought about at night after he turned out the lights. I think that things are almost over. Then he added with a smile, but there's still time. No need to get too worried just yet. His optimism was genuine, not just an attempt to comfort me. You wake up one day and you're old, just like that, with no warning. It's stunning, he added. I heard years ago that there comes a time in the life of a writer when you are no longer able to write a long work of fiction. The head can no longer hold the vast architecture or navigate the perilous crossing of a lengthy novel. It's true, I can feel it now, so it will be shorter pieces from now on. When he was 80, I asked him what that was like. The view from 80 is astonishing, really, and the end is near. Are you afraid? It makes me immensely sad. When I think back on these moments, I'm genuinely moved by how forthcoming he was, especially given the cruelty of the questions. They feel like even more cruel questions as I reread them.
I love that opening for so many reasons. And I think for me, it encapsulated so nicely something that I think it was your dad's secretary said about him. Like, even ugly things he can talk about beautifully. And that was something we talked about in our Zoom yesterday, how threaded throughout there were these gorgeous passages that otherwise could have been very tender or sad, and they were those things too, but they were really beautiful. And was that something how did you think about approaching a book where you knew you were going to be writing about death and grief in a way that would also bring this spirit to it and this beauty, really?
Well, I mean, that of course was the challenge, although, like I've said elsewhere, writing a book wasn't really the original idea. It was just taking notes to have it as something to remember for myself, my brother, our children. Um, but yeah, once I sat down to write, it's a challenge because, I'm writing about a very famous man, and I knew a lot of people would be interested in his final days. So the chances of getting this published were high, regardless of its quality. So I did want to write something that was as well written as I could make it, but also that challenge of writing about, personal feelings and difficult feelings, but not coming across as too sentimental or too self-serving, and also not giving the sense that you're exposing a family's very private and painful moment, just for your own fame. But these are the problems of writing. Everyone who has to write, every book has its challenges, and this one was balancing the personal with the public, the private with the public.
And what was the process of writing like for you? So it seemed like you were keeping a journal and you were taking notes. And then how did you kind of imagine the form that the memoir would take? To me, it felt like very much like snapshots in a way, like we were going through almost like a photo album with you. Like it was like, here's a scene that kind of had that great episodic quality. But I'm curious what the process was like, and if the journaling part was the more therapeutic part, or kind of like if your feelings or thoughts changed once you decided, okay, this is something that I might publish.
Initially I took notes as things were happening in those last 3 weeks, and again with no real idea of what to do with it. And then a few days after my father died, I realized that if I didn't sit down and put it all down quickly, I may not have the strength to do it later, or I may not have the strength to revisit it. So I did sit down and I kind of wrote it in a way that reflected the notes. They are discrete moments of things that were happening. It's not really a narrative, because you're not really, you're just sitting around waiting for someone to pass, which is a very strange situation. The days are short and long and a little amorphous. So I wrote it down in the present tense, like the notes were, almost as if I was writing it as I was living it. And so the form of the book kind of presented itself, and I wasn't sure about it. That's just what I found worked for me. Was to take those notes and write them in the present tense as if I am there living it during those 3 weeks. And then when I finished that, I still didn't know what it was. I thought it was too short to be a book, too long to be an article. I wasn't sure I wanted to publish it at all. And so I put it aside for years. And it wasn't until my mom died in August of 2020 that I realized what the subject matter was that interested me, why I would want to finish that book, write that book, show that book. Because it was the farewell to both your parents, to what it means to lose your second parent, and how, it's almost like the end of the world that made you who you are.
Yeah, and I think that was my biggest takeaway from the book, like what a love letter to your parents, and how beautiful the way that you crafted it. Because if I think about that would be like the hardest thing for me to do, is to give thanks to my parents, and also to show them as people and complex people and how wonderful and beautiful they are. So I think that that really came through. I'm curious too, one thing we talked about is how much did you decide how much of your mom to put into the book? Because she's threaded throughout, and she has all these like great moments. And I think there are so many that we talked about. Like there's the moment where you say, like, her shit list was short, but if you were on it, like, good luck to you.
And it's a shit list that included, everything from a butcher to a couple heads of state. I mean, it was generous.
But yeah, I'm curious when you were threading the line, because it seemed like the sense that we got a little bit was that your dad maybe was a little bit more open to you perhaps writing about him and the family, but maybe your mom had. There's this other great line where you talk about, her love of watching like gossip or celebrity TV shows, but she really had this maybe stronger line of where the private started. So we were curious about how you thought about writing about her and how she kind of comes into the book a little bit in the end, but maybe not so or quantity-wise, volume-wise as much on the page as your dad.
It gave me freedom to write about her. The idea that I knew that was not going to be published as long as she could read it, So in some sense, I didn't have to edit myself because I knew that she was not going to read that. And early on, I wasn't even sure I was going to show it at all. But she just kept appearing, making like she did in real life, these little appearances. She had these moments that were always incisive and powerful, cutting to the bone with with humor, with insight, with ill temper, with impatience, with affection. She always surprised, like my father said. And then, after she died and I saw, like I said, what I thought the book should be, I did devote that final section almost exclusively to her, and to them as a couple also, but almost exclusively to her. And I had fun doing it. It brought me very close to her, and of course you say things and think things that you haven't thought before or said out loud before. And I say it in the book, on the one hand, you are more forgiving of your parents because you see them more as people and what they went through, and the fact that they were of flesh and bone and had strengths and weaknesses, and of course there are things that they did that were mistakes or things that angered you, and like all parents and children, we had arguments about many things. But the book wasn't about the moments. The book was about the balance. um, and uh, and so yeah, I dedicated that last part about her, and thinking about her. But what I was going to say is, parents, you see them as more flawed, and you accept that. But also after they die, they become these gigantic figures, that just walk alongside you.
Something I liked in the latter half of the book is how your mom came through in relationships with other people. Like there were, I don't know if it was either your daughters or your nieces have that moment when your mom is talking on the phone and she just says very matter of fact, like your dad died. And it's like this moment that's very funny to the kids because it's like, oh, that's, their grandmother being their grandmother, and we some people were talking about that in our Zoom yesterday who have had parents who've been with their parents at the end when they've died, and just saying how you did such a wonderful job of showing all these emotions and feelings that we have, or maybe it seems like bizarre or awkward or weird that something happens, but it's like, as humans, it's like all of these feelings and the things they live right pressed up right against each other. I think that's something there's another moment where you say, nothing stops for death. Like it's like everything else is still moving and spinning in a way.
Yeah. And also, there's humor in these situations. I think it's part of, the sadness and the strangeness when someone has just died, and it's, you can be sad, you can be heartbroken, but there's also a part of you that doesn't believe it. And of course there are the young people who are there, my children and my brother's children, and of course they were sad, but I think in different, periods of our life, we see death in a different way. I'm not saying it's easy for them, but they are together and they are young people and they end up talking about other things, and the grandmother made them laugh. I mean, there's something absurd about someone dying. I mean, it's very hard to wrap your mind around it, even beyond the tragedy and the sadness of it. But there is laughter. I mean, my mother herself, stopped going to funerals when she was young, because the moment she walked into a funeral, she would collapse with laughter. She just could not help herself. She and her cousin, and so she was unable to attend funerals. She was banned from them for many years.
Yeah. That's pretty funny. Yeah, and I think going back to that idea of death, there was a passage that I loved on, I think this is on, what page is this? 34, where you're talking about how a water drip could be interrupted, and you say the ideas are intriguing and absurd, practical, compassionate, murderous, and this idea comes up a few times with death being all of these different things at once. You also play with the idea of time, like this idea between the possible and the probable, the definitive, and how like death doesn't disappoint. And you have, I think there's another moment where you talk about your dad saying like, you know, how he eschewed kind of these ideas of over analyzing his literature, looking for like symbols everywhere, but then there are these beautiful symbols throughout the book. And of course, this idea you talk about, you know, his unconscious and being obsessed with death as order and disorder, logic and nonsense, and inevitable and unacceptable. And I was kind of curious as you were going through the book, and obviously you have excerpts from different books of his throughout, how you kind of thought about that, and did you look to his literature and as a way of kind of like examining death and loss as you were writing the book?
Well, you know, like I mentioned in the book, you know, my father always said that one of the things that bothered him the most about death was that it was the only aspect of his life that he was not going to be able to write about. You know, everything that he thought or lived or experienced or witnessed, he wrote about in his books, not in an openly autobiographical way, but certainly, you know, about his feelings, and even if they were dramatized or ciphered or hidden. But of course, the act of dying was something he was not going to be able to write about. But that was just, you know, another sign of you know what I believe, which is a lot of writers are obsessed by death, and I think that obsession by death, which is, you know, the thing you can't control, I think is one of the things that fuels writers, you know, that trying to tell the story and frame it and make sense of it, and see where things come from and which way they're going, and what is the meaning of it. Um, so when I, you know, was thinking of it finally as a book, I thought, well, you know, he didn't write about his own death, but he does have what I think are some of his best passages are about the death of his main characters. And many came to mind. You know, I put 4 or 5 in there, but there were more. You know, he was very good about killing them properly, or or writing about it beautifully. Um, and I think they ended up being good markers. I mean, I struggled a little bit. You know, you don't want the book to be this ode to death, but it is about the absurdity and you know, it's both tremendous and absurd, and it's both, you know, inevitable and unacceptable.
A question that we had in our Zoom yesterday was, how did you end up picking the excerpts that you chose? Was that a difficult process, or did you kind of have ones that you were drawn to from the start?
Yeah, you know, I had them at the right at the top of my head. I could remember them because I'd read them. I mean, the one about the death of Aureliano Buendia, I always remembered because, you know, and I write about that in the book. He's one of the main characters, arguably the main character of 100 Years of Solitude. And you know, when he died, my father went up and announced it to my mom, who was just waking up from a nap, and said, you know, I killed the colonel. And they both felt there like a loved one had died. Um, you know, 2 deaths that close books. You know, he has 3 deaths that close books. You know, the general in his labyrinth about Simon Bolivar. The last paragraph is about his death. The Autumn of the Patriarch. The last paragraph is finally the death of the dictator. Chronicle of a Death Foretold is a book that tells the death over and over and over and over, the same death from many points of view throughout the book, and ends, of course, with the death. So it didn't take much research, let's say, for me to remember some of these passages. Yeah, I only changed it in the last one, the one about my mom. You know, I had an excerpt which were the final lines of Love in the Time of Cholera. I thought it was more appropriate to talk about, you know, the love between 2 people rather than about death.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a question you're tired of answering, but someone else asked this too, was, when did you start reading your dad's books, and do you have one that kind of sticks with you more than the others?
You know, I grew up from age 8 hearing talk about 100 years of solitude so much that I just thought I was bored with it. I was 12, 13. I couldn't hear about it anymore. But then when I was maybe 16 or about to turn 16, I finally read it, and it really blew me away. I mean, it was like, what? This really? You wrote this? Okay. It's like seeing your father in a whole new light. And I read it again in my 20s and my 30s. I mean, I have a lot of books of him that I like. He is, I think, remarkably even for a writer. He has more than just a couple of great books, and certainly a lot of people feel like Love in the Time of Cholera is his best book. But I think for me, all things considered, both the form, the experimentation in storytelling, the way he plays with time, and at the same time tells you incredible stories and incredible lives. I think 100 Years of Solitude for me is the book.
One passage that we all really loved was when you talk about your dad's writing cycle, which was very relatable and funny. So this is on
Yes.
page 81, and you're just talking about his daily routine. So despite that, he gets really into like the zone and he's writing, and he goes, despite this, promptly at 2:30, our father would be sitting at lunch with us, totally present. He'd often start by announcing that he was writing the best novel since the great Russian novels of the 19th century, then move on to any and all subjects, often interrogating us about our day. After the afternoon nap, his enthusiasm began to weaken. By dinner time, he would comment that the next day's work was difficult, that it included a couple of serious hurdles, and that clearing them was crucial to the creative success of the book. By breakfast the next morning, he was frank about his new level of worry. If today doesn't go well, the whole novel might be at best. If that's the case, I would abandon it. Later at lunch, the cycle would begin again. And I just thought that was such a fun way of not poking fun at him, but just you have these great moments of really bringing out all these different sides of your parents, and
Yeah,
just so
and
fun.
listen, I mean, to anyone who I was going to say does creative work, but anyone who does any work, your average day is feeling that I'm a genius and I'm an idiot, sort of back and forth. And I think that's the same for everyone. That's the same, and there were books I think that he abandoned because he was never thought he found what he called the tone. The tone was everything for him, how to tell the story, not just the structure, which could be worked on, but finding the tone. Um, and But also, like I said in the book, he never reread his books. He was always very scared that he'd write them and find them very deficient, and that would paralyze him from writing again. Rereading a book and thinking, oh, this is crap.
Yeah, no, I definitely related to that roller coaster ride that you go on.
Well, that's the normal. I'm great, I'm a failure.
The other thing we talked about a little bit in our book club Zoom yesterday was how you tease out this idea of how we have these different aspects of our lives. We have the public, the private, and the secret. And I think there's this great moment at the public funeral memorial that you have where people are coming up and they're calling your dad by his nickname Gabo, and you say like it's a moment where of a reminder that he also very much belonged to other people, and of course your dad's a very famous figure, but I related to that too because I think we have these moments where we see whether it's a parent or someone else in our life that the first way we think of them is maybe a certain way, and then we realize like, oh, they have all of these other relationships and people see them in different ways and people think they know them. But I was just curious how you kind of thought about that throughout the writing process. And
I didn't think of it that much till I was at the memorial, and literally thousands of people who had stood outside in the drizzle, went by, and it was I mean, it was remarkable. I was very used to my father's fame, especially in Latin America, where he was a popular figure like soccer players or actors are. But that was really something to see, and also that sense of ownership that people have, calling him by his first name and walking by, leaving him flowers, leaving him his own books, leaving them mementos, religious objects. I think it's rare for a writer, very rare for a writer to elicit such a personal response, such a
Mm.
sense of bond, such a personal bond uh, with writers. In fact, I feel that's something that I sort of underwrote a little bit. I should have gone into it a little more, but I didn't want to get bogged down there. But it really was remarkable to see that yes, he did in fact belong to a lot of other people, and 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 it brings you back to this idea: do we ever really know our parents, and do parents really ever know their children? I mean, every person is a universe, and even if you're close, even if you are in love with someone and they love you back, um, it's two worlds.
Yeah, and I think that was another thing that came through for the moment when you're after your dad has passed, and you say your mom's walking up the stairs, and maybe she was typically a slower walker, but you say it's clear that the group has allowed her to lead. And in that moment, it was like you all felt the, not in a bad way, the weight, but the depth of the amount of time that they had spent with each other, and recognizing that in that moment she was the primary, she was the connection, and everyone was looking to her. So I think you do a nice job of showing how there are these different moments where certain connections become really primary, and then you realize there are these other connections as well.
Yeah, this is minutes after my father's death. We had been with him, of course, constantly, but he didn't seem like he was imminently going to die. So we went down and met downstairs for a while, and then he passed away. And I called my mother, and she was down with my brother and his family, and they came up, and my mother came into the room, and it was something to behold. How you know the a love story of 50 years plus, and children and grandchildren, and living together in the huge world that they had. I mean, their world, even now, I was thinking this week that my own world has shrunk since they died, and I'm a very gregarious person who has a lot of friends, who's in contact with people, and I'm out there, but still my world seems smaller since they're not around. So to see her come into the room, essentially to say goodbye to her husband, to see him a minute after 3 minutes after he has died, it was a stunning sight. I mean, just the power of a bond broken like that. I mean, as broken as it can be, broken by separation, but not broken. It was stunning to behold.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we talked about is just while this is about death and grief, it was so much about story for me. Like, I think there's that great line where it's something like, a good story is better than the truth. A good story was the truth. And there were all these moments where we saw how many people in your family were these wonderful storytellers, and how the family really prized story. Like, there's even a moment where the con man like comes in after your dad's died and cons your mom out of like $200 or something. But it's almost like, oh, well, it's going to be a great story type. Like, I got that like feeling. And was that something that you always kind of recognized growing up, like how beyond your dad
Oh,
obviously being a
yeah.
writer of story, but just the idea of storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, his official line, which he said to us, which I quote in the book, is there's nothing better than something well written. But of course, that applies to something well told, and an anecdote well told, a joke well told, a story. What happened to you on the drive over, and it was always an ongoing writer's lab. Well, no, don't start with that. Do this first. Start at the beginning. Don't skip this. It was always we were always experimenting with how a story is told best. um, and I think I mean, everyone loves anecdotes, but anecdote is a particularly beloved form of storytelling in the Caribbean. Everyone always has a story to tell you, not unlike the American South, I have to say. I think that's something shared, and with the world. But it reminds me, I'm now in Richmond, Virginia, and there's something of that. But yeah, storytelling, was it. There's What a great story. There's in the book, there's the inexplicable coincidence of the dead bird, which, I guess it has to be read to to be fully understood. And someone asked me, what would your father say? And he'd say, how about that? meaning, don't ask, don't figure, just tell it.
Yeah, no, I thought the bird was great. And also another like kind of sign moment when you get on the plane, I think you're going from Mexico City back to LA and someone in an aisle near you is reading 100 Years of Solitude. That was like,
The woman next to me on her phone, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, wow, if she only knew that I'm almost literally coming from that memorial. Um, and on the phone, it was also a sign of, the passage of time and how, things go on, and the book still captures, a book that was written, several decades before cell phones and internets and everything.
no, I love that. Before I let you go, what stories are you excited about now? Is there anything that you're working on that you can tell us about, or anything you're reading or watching?
As far as work, I'm in Virginia, prepping a movie that I start shooting next week. It's a script I wrote about two half brothers who are burying a father that they hated. Not autobiographical this time. Um, and I'm very excited about that. That's with Ewan McGregor and Ethan Hawke. And in reading, I'm someone who rereads a lot and rereads a lot of classic books. Last year I reread, and this week I reread To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's book. I'd read it when I was young and thought it was good. Read it last year and it blew me away, and it continues to. I mean, that's an amazing book, and she was, of course, one of my dad's favorite writers. So you can never go wrong with Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, I love that line too, where your dad talks about like the iconic authors who never won the Nobel Prize or never won such prize, and then you list his three favorite.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite sections too, where you talk about just
Yeah.
your dad's love of all different types of art and what someone would say highbrow and lowbrow, it didn't matter, and his way of
Didn't matter.
referring things back to his culture, like that. Who is it? That Elton John moment where you guys are watching
Elton
him?
John, yes. I don't think he had any more than a vague idea of who Elton John was, but he saw him on TV and said, God, this guy's a genius. I was like, yes, thank you. Thank you for telling. But the fact that he could see it and be totally enthralled and infatuated just with a person of genius, singing songs, beautiful songs. I mean, he was insatiable that way, and could enjoy, magazines and anything, whatever told a good story.
I love that. Well, this is such a beautiful story. I
Thank you
love
very much.
reading it. Anyone who hasn't picked it up, and we'll have to stay tuned for this next movie of yours. Very exciting. And I hope you write more books, because this one was really beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, it was so lovely chatting. And everyone else stay on. I'm going to announce I can't believe it's October. So for October, we are reading China Room by Sanjeev Sahota. Some of you might have seen this. This was long listed for the Booker Prize this year, and I don't want to say too much about it, because part of why I love this book was it surprised me. Every chapter, as soon as I thought, okay, I've had this character figured out, I know what's going to happen here, I know how I feel about this situation, it would completely change by the end of the section. And I love that. It was so brilliant and surprising and just deeply, deeply imaginative. So all I'll say is there's two storylines. So in the roughly contemporary, it's 1999, and a teenage boy has gone to visit his family in Punjab, where he's hoping to basically grit his way through an addiction. And he winds up at his family's home, where his great-great-grandmother has come a century or 70 or so years before, when she is a young bride and she doesn't know who her husband is. And this becomes a place where we both find out these desires that these have, and their secrets, and there's beautiful consequences and dangerous consequences to what they want. It's really, really just so well done and transfixing. So China Room, we're reading for October. You can go to goop.com/goopbookclub for all the info. We will have the page updated October 1st. You'll see a Q&A with Sanjeev there. all the deets. You can join our Facebook group and then just checking the date. So I'll be back on here on Wednesday, October 27th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, so in the morning this time, talking to Sanjeev, which I'm very excited to do. And we will have another group Zoom for just our book club members at the end of the month. So hope you can join us. And thanks for listening today. Bye.